Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I'm reviewing The Time Traveller's Guide to Regency Britain by Ian Mortimer. This is a relatively new release. I believe it came out in December of 2020 and at time of recording it's actually only out in a hardback edition. I actually didn't buy this edition until I was already about halfway through the book because I started listening to it on audiobook, but then very quickly realized that this would be better served by reading it on paper. And I was right. This is a very comprehensive, big, detailed book. And if you are going to get this, I would definitely recommend getting it on paper to get access to all of the footnotes, all of the sources, the glossary, and of course the illustrations. This is the first time I'm reading any book by Ian Mortimer, but I'm aware of his Time Traveller's Guide series of books, which started with the Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England over a decade ago, and since then he has been going through the periods of British history and writing books about a specific time period from the perspective of a time traveler. That is essentially the approach that he takes to history. And I find that approach very interesting. I am a music historian myself, so my knowledge of history is very, very specialized. But I do indeed study the same period, so it was very fascinating to get this kind of overview on one hand, because it doesn't go deep down into very specific aspects of history, but at the same time there is so much detail in how he presents this history. So the setup of The Time Traveller's Guide to Regency Britain is, imagine if you travel to Regency Britain. What do you see? What do you hear? Who do you talk to? What do you eat? What do you drink? Where might you work? How might you educate your children? And this is what I find incredibly fascinating. It is about everyday life in the Regency. I should here point out, by the way, that he talks about the sort of long Regency period from 1789 to 1830, rather than, strictly speaking, the Regency years of when the Prince Regent was in power from 1811 to 1820. So we're looking at a 4 decades long time span, and that time span itself is treated with a lot of nuance. So for example, when we take a little tour of London, we don't just take a tour of London throughout those 40 years, but we take 3 different tours of London in 3 different times, and we get to experience the change in the actual infrastructure of the town. And he takes that approach to several things. So for example, when he talks about, say, employment, he will say, if you time travel to 1810, you might see this, but if you time travel to 1827, this might have already changed. So you don't just get a static image of the past, but in fact, an image of the change that happened over the course of those 4 decades. At first, the address to the reader in second person does seem a little bit strange. I'm just going to read you the first few sentences of chapter 1 of the book. As your ship approaches the south coast of England, you'll be looking out for land. If you are sailing from France, the white cliffs of Dover may be in your sights for most of the crossing. If you are travelling from America, you will be staring at the horizon for days, searching in vain for that rising blue ridge of the southwest peninsula, and seeing nothing but the dreary waste of white foam on heaving grey-green water. So this kind of style, this addressing the reader directly, saying you might do this, or you could go here, or this is what you are going to see. It seems a little bit strange at first, especially if you're used to reading history books, but you kind of get into it, and for me at least, that slight aspect of immersion made it more fun to read. As for the topics that Ian Mortimer discusses, they are pretty much, well, not quite every aspect of everyday life that you can think of, but many aspects of everyday life that you can think of. Things like travel, infrastructure, entertainment, music, even down to things like how do you actually send a letter in Regency Britain? How do you get from A to B? What's the difference between different types of coaches? How does conversation work? But also broader, more structural things about society. For example, how did wages differ between different professions? What was the wealth gap between the poorest and the richest in society? Who actually had the power? How were children treated at the time? How were women treated at the time? There are many, many different aspects of society that Ian Mortimer does touch on. And because of the scope of the book, of course, it was impossible for him to go into detail on every single thing, but there was no large bit that I felt was missing in this. I liked how the author explained the everyday lives of people by obviously looking at what they actually consumed and what they did, but also then trying to find the reason behind that. How did big political events influence the period? One famous example is, of course, the Napoleonic Wars and all of the effects that they had on life in Britain, and not just from the amount of taxes that people paid, but also to things like the food that they ate and the dresses that they wore. What was the role of the Prince Regent in influencing the society that he then came to lead? But Ian Mortimer also takes into account the effects of environmental issues. Obviously, we are familiar with the year without a summer, 1816, and how that had an effect on the people at the time, but also going further into the Industrial Revolution and the effects that industry had on people, both in the countryside and in towns and cities. One thing that I found really interesting was, for example, to look at farming practices, and I'd never thought I'd say that in my life, but the farming practices chapter is so fascinating because it shows how innovation is not just a 20th century thing, but even comparing farming in 1815 with farming a century or 2 centuries earlier is already showing a decent amount of change, and that change has an effect on people's lives. So generally speaking, if you're interested in this period, this is a fantastic place to start. And even if you're familiar with the period, like I think I am, there is still loads and loads of stuff to learn from this book. I enjoy how it's structured, I enjoy how it's written, the style, and I enjoy the attention to detail that is provided in the hardback edition with a really fantastically written index. So if you are interested, for example, in language, you can look exactly at the pages that discuss language, change in language, what language was used, etc. I know that I am for certain going to have a good look at the notes, which is essentially the bibliography for this work. And the illustrations, I think there could have been more, frankly, but the ones that are in there are, nice to look at and illustrate the points that he is making in this book. So overall, a very well turned out work of pop history, but not without its flaws. And I would like to talk about those for a little bit now. First, let's talk about some sort of minor issues. As I've said, I know quite a lot about a very specific part of Regency history, and that is specifically about women's domestic music. So I was a little bit put off when I found some inaccuracies in the discussion of that. And these inaccuracies I found were mostly in sort of single sentences where you can tell that it was kind of a throwaway line, but where there was an inaccuracy or simply a wrong fact. So let me just read out a little bit in the chapter about girls' education. For the rich, this includes sewing samplers, playing the piano, flute and harp, dancing, speaking French and Italian, and practicing penmanship. Because I am a researcher in that particular aspect, I know that playing the flute was not, in fact, a part of girls' education. Quite the opposite. It was very inappropriate for girls to play the flute. It was not considered a ladylike instrument at all. And you wouldn't find British girls learning the flute traditionally. Of course, there were always exceptions. Whereas playing the piano and harp were very much encouraged for girls. Playing the flute, was really seen as a man's instrument. This is not a big deal in itself, right? You're not going to get a completely wrong impression of the period when you read that sentence. But it is things like that that make me think, where are there inaccuracies in the text that I didn't notice because I am not familiar with them? A second one that I noticed was in the chapter about fashion. And this is what Ian Mortimer says. Fashion magazines are published from the 1790s, among them the Ladies' Magazine, the Gallery of Fashion, and the Ladies' Monthly Museum. I am familiar with two of those magazines, which are the Ladies' Magazine and the Ladies' Monthly Museum, and neither of them can be considered fashion magazines, even though that is how he describes them. Fashion magazines, blah blah, among them the Ladies' Magazine and the Ladies' Monthly Museum. So if he had actually looked at issues of those magazines, he might have noticed that very little in those magazines is actually about fashion. Most of the issues in those magazines are filled with fiction, non-fiction, history texts, and other sort of just general magazine articles with 1 or 2 pages taken up by fashion. So it is inaccurate to describe them as fashion magazines. Again, tiny detail, but it does make me question about whether those inaccuracies are mostly concerning women's history, and whether maybe he should have taken a little bit more care to look into the actualities of the lives of the people who are not men. It would be a shame if that was the case, if he had been more careful to get the accuracy right for things that concern men, but for things that concern women, such as domestic music and magazines, maybe he made some assumptions that clearly were not backed up by good evidence. So this was the little nitpicking, but frankly the biggest criticism I have about the book, and I found this quite shocking to read, is in the chapter titled Character, when he talks about, and I am quoting him here, homosexuality and lesbianism and transvestitism. So when he talks about essentially LGBT and queer issues, the language used in that chapter is so outdated that I would have easily believed this was written in the 1970s. First of all, using the word homosexuality to mean gay and queer men, and then lesbianism to mean lesbians and other queer women. The terminology, it just read so old-fashioned. But the really big issue was when he talks about what he calls transvestitism. Here I am going to put out a content warning because the language is frankly transphobic and I don't want you to be exposed to that unnecessarily. So I will be reading out bits from this book. If you want to skip past those, I will put up a timestamp here. At no point in this book is there an acknowledgement of the existence of trans people at all. And the closest we get to is in this passage, which I will read out to you because I feel like it's important for you to know this before you get this book, if you are interested in this. There are few men who simply want to live as women do, quietly and without fuss. If you consider the disadvantages faced by women, the sexual prejudice, the lack of power over their own property, and the limited opportunities, you have to admit that they have not chosen the easy option. Spare a thought for those men who really do identify as female in this period, and who, until the day they die, live in fear of discovery. So I get the sentiment, but the language is horrendous and it needs to be amended. I have already drafted up an email that I'm still kind of trying to find the right person to send it to, whether that's going to be the editor. I'm certainly not going to directly email the author because I don't think that's appropriate, but I am going to try and send an email about this bit to the editor, to the publishing house. Even just this small paragraph, for me, taints the book. And I don't know if you feel the same, and obviously you have the right to feel your own feelings about this. But I don't understand how in most of the book, Ian Mortimer takes such a sensitive approach to the 19th century. And then when he talks about trans issues, falls back onto language from past times and language that is today a dog whistle for transphobic sentiment. I don't want to assume anything about the author himself here, but I am sincerely hoping that this bit will be amended before the paperback comes out, and that this bit will be amended in future editions of this book. Quick update. I wrote to the publisher about this 3 working days ago, and I haven't heard back from them yet. I do want to give them benefit of the doubt, of course, but I also really need to upload this video, so I can't really wait any longer for a response. However, I'll make sure to update the description box of this video if I do hear back from them. So if you are watching this in the future, make sure you check the description box to see if there has been any update, and response I get, I will post in the description box as an update. And if you are thinking that you can't talk about trans issues in the Regency period because the terminology didn't exist at the time and there was no debate around transgender people, well, there may not have been the terminology, but the people still existed, and therefore it is entirely appropriate to discuss their lives with the same sensitivity that everyone deserves to have their life discussed in a history book. The author actually agrees with me on that. I'm going to read you a little section from his envoy bit, from his afterwards, so to speak. By directly juxtaposing our daily lives with those of our ancestors, we may get a better impression of the quality and significance of what it means to be alive now as well as then. We can see the many advantages that we take for granted but which our forebears were denied, as well as those things that they enjoyed but which we do not. Some people might claim this is anachronistic because it mixes up the values of the present and the past. However, this is no more of an issue in A Time Traveler's Guide than it is in any other history book. All historical writing is anachronistic to a certain degree, because everything we say and appreciate about the past is filtered through the experience of our own lives. To talk about pain in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance requires us to know what pain is. If we refer to hate, fear, starvation, or enslavement, again, our understanding of these things is based on our personal knowledge of what it means to be despised, feel afraid, go hungry, or be denied freedom. If you haven't experienced them, you need to imagine them based on what you do know. Thus, the contemporary world of the historian intrudes on every historical understanding. And later on he says, an important lesson follows on from this. Academic historians are constantly reminding us that we should judge historical individuals according to the values and standards that they themselves recognized. Obviously, if you want to know why a historical figure did something or why someone reacted in the way they did, yes, you need that contemporary understanding. But in A Time Traveler's Guide, I find myself constantly questioning this narrow view that we should only judge people by their own values, by exposing those views themselves to judgment. And in this particular volume, the results are perhaps more striking than in any of the others. If you only judge an 18th century man by the values he and his contemporaries shared, you will wind up with a form of history that has no relevance to the modern public, who do not share those 18th century values. So Ian Mortimer himself advocates for taking a modern approach to historiography. He advocates that we look at the people of the past like we would look at people of our own time, hence the Time Traveler's Guide. He wants to throw us in the middle of the past. He wants to bring history to life by seeing the people of the past as real human beings and as people who are not beyond our own judgment. And then he contradicts himself so much by writing about transvestitism when he's talking about possibly trans people. And again, you can take a nuanced approach to this. You can say that the documents of the past will not let us talk about the same identities that we have words for today. Someone in the past may have been a trans woman or a cross-dressing man or any other number of identities that we recognize today, but that does not give the author the license to use discriminatory, offensive and outdated language. So this rant went on a little bit longer than I had expected, but I thought it was important to point out because more so than those small inaccuracies about whether women played the flute or not, I found that bit was the biggest stain on this book and the reason why I can't give an unconditional recommendation for this book. I still think you should read it. if you're interested in life in the Regency period. This book has clearly been written with a lot of care, a lot of work, a lot of research and a lot of detail, and it has taught me a lot. I can only hope that those issues that I spoke about are going to be edited in the next edition of the book, whether that be the paperback or the next hardback edition, because otherwise it really is a treasure trove of information about the Regency. So very mixed feelings about this. I would love to know your opinion, what you made of it. I can certainly say for myself that I am going to have a look at Ian Mortimer's other work, his previous work. I found his style for the large part engaging. If you are thinking of buying this, I would not recommend getting the audiobook because there is just so much more to the printed version. And Ian Mortimer, while not a terrible audiobook narrator by any means, so he narrates his own audiobook, is not the most engaging. But yeah, lots of thoughts about this book. This has definitely been one of my longer book review videos, but I thought it was important to talk about all of the issues as well as all of the wonderful things about the Time Traveller's Guide to Regency Britain. Thank you for watching. Bye.